The child I was babysitting waved at something outside the window every night, and last night I saw it wave back. Tonight, Dread Scribe writes again. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And if there's a story you'd like me to cover next, I'd love to hear it too. The first thing I noticed about the house was how quiet it was. Not the kind of quiet you get in a library or a peaceful forest, but a hollow, unnatural kind of silence. Like the air itself was holding its breath. Even my footsteps seemed too loud as I moved through the narrow hallway carrying my overnight bag. The parents had been kind but hurried, clearly late for their dinner reservation, leaving me with a rushed list of instructions and a promise that their little boy, Evan, would sleep straight through the night. For the first hour, everything felt almost too perfect. The baby monitor sat on the coffee table, its soft glow like a tiny lighthouse in the darkened living room. I scrolled absent-mindedly through my phone, the low hum of white noise from the monitor fading into the background like a distant waterfall. White noise has always been oddly comforting to me, like a veil that blurs the sharp edges of the world. Scientists say it calms the brain, lulling it into a rhythm of predictability. But that night, it felt more like a fragile barrier between me and something waiting in the dark. It happened just after 10:30. One moment, there was the soft, steady hiss of static. The next, a piercing scream ripped through the speaker, sharp enough to make me drop my phone. My heart lurched into my throat as I froze, listening. It wasn't a baby's cry. It was louder, rawer, filled with a kind of primal terror that made my skin crawl. My first instinct was to run upstairs, but a strange hesitation held me back. I glanced toward the ceiling, expecting to hear some movement, some sign of chaos in the nursery above. Instead, there was nothing. The house was as silent as before, except for the monitor. My breath came shallow and fast as I picked it up, gripping it so tightly my knuckles went white. "Evan?" I whispered, though I knew he couldn't answer. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a strange crackling. At first it was just static, but then it began to shift, warping into distorted tones, like a voice trying to form words. I leaned closer, straining to hear, when I realized the sounds weren't random at all. Amid the static, a single word emerged, stretched and broken but unmistakable. My name. I dropped the monitor as if it had burned me. The device hit the carpet with a soft thud, the light still glowing steadily. My mind scrambled for explanations. Faulty electronics, a neighbor's baby monitor picking up the signal, auditory pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find meaning where there is none. I'd read about experiments where people swore they heard voices in white noise when told to listen carefully, but no amount of rationalizing could erase the icy certainty crawling up my spine. I had heard my name, clearly, deliberately. Gathering every shred of courage, I forced myself to climb the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound impossibly loud in the oppressive quiet. When I reached the nursery, I found Evan sleeping peacefully in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling with perfect rhythm. Relief flooded through me until I noticed something that froze me in place. The baby monitor on the dresser was switched off. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the dark, lifeless monitor on the dresser. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the soft, rhythmic breaths of the baby in the crib. My mind reeled, desperately trying to stitch together an explanation that made sense. Had I imagined it? Maybe I'd been so absorbed in the quiet that my brain invented sounds the way it sometimes creates shapes and shadows. But the glow from the monitor downstairs was real. I had seen it with my own eyes, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat in the dark. And I had heard my name. That detail lodged itself in my mind like a splinter, impossible to ignore. Machines don't know names. I backed slowly away from the crib, careful not to wake Evan. His face was serene, his little hands curled like unopened flowers. It struck me in that moment how defenseless he was. The thought sparked something primal in me, a fierce need to protect him, even though I didn't yet understand what I was protecting him from. Descending the stairs, I felt as though the house itself was holding me in a grip. The walls seemed to lean inward, the silence now oppressive, a vacuum pulling at my sanity. I reached the living room and saw the monitor still glowing softly on the carpet where I'd dropped it. I bent to pick it up, half expecting to hear static again, but the speaker was eerily silent. Then came the breathing. At first I thought it was my own, shallow, panicked, ragged. But no, this was different. It was steady and deliberate, like someone standing very close, just out of sight, inhaling and exhaling with mechanical precision. My skin prickled as the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the room like invisible fog. I spun around, scanning the shadows. The corners of the room seemed deeper than they had before, pools of darkness that felt almost alive. "Hello?" My voice cracked, breaking the stillness. No response. Just that slow, measured breathing, as though whoever, whatever, was there, wanted me to know they were in no rush. The logical part of my mind clung desperately to explanations. Old houses make strange noises. Ventilation systems can create eerie effects like distant voices or footsteps. There's even a phenomenon called infrasound, low-frequency vibrations that can cause unease and hallucinations. Maybe that was all this was, but deep down I didn't believe it. The breathing grew louder, closer, until it felt like warm air was brushing against my skin. My instincts screamed at me to run, but some force rooted me to the spot. Slowly, almost against my will, I lifted the baby monitor to my ear. The breathing was coming through the speaker now, amplified and intimate. And beneath it, faint but unmistakable, a voice whispered my name again. I dropped the monitor and bolted for the front door, yanking at the lock with trembling hands. It wouldn't budge. Behind me, the breathing stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the world. Then from the darkness of the hallway came the soft creak of a floorboard, followed by a child's giggle. The house felt like a relic from another century, a preserved fragment of history tucked into the quiet streets of an old neighborhood. Its high ceilings and ornate woodwork were beautiful in the way ancient cathedrals are beautiful. Intricate, imposing, and just a little bit unsettling. The family had warned me about its quirks when they left for their evening event. The floorboards creaked, the heating pipes moaned, and the shadows, well, they tended to play tricks on you at night. I'd laughed politely at that, not realizing how deeply those words would root themselves in my mind. For the first hour, I told myself I was fine. The two kids had fallen asleep quickly upstairs, their soft breathing a rhythmic comfort beneath the whispering hum of the old radiator. I curled up on the velvet couch in the parlor, scrolling through my phone as the grandfather clock ticked steadily nearby. But as the minutes passed, the house seemed to grow heavier, like a blanket draped too tightly over my senses. Every creak of wood felt amplified, every draft of cold air like the brush of unseen fingers. It was when I stood to refill my glass of water that I noticed it. The staircase stretched up into darkness like a tunnel, its ornate banister casting sharp, angled lines against the wallpaper. At the base of the stairs, where the shadows pooled deepest, something lingered. A shape, darker than the surrounding darkness, as if the night itself had gathered into a single spot. It didn't move, didn't sway with the shifting light, and yet my breath caught in my throat the moment I saw it. I froze, telling myself it was nothing more than a trick of perception. The human brain is wired to find patterns, even where none exist, a phenomenon called pareidolia. Just as we see faces in clouds or animals in constellations, our minds stitch random fragments of light and shadow into familiar forms. I whispered this explanation to myself like a mantra, clinging to logic as my pulse quickened. But even as I tried to rationalize, the shadow seemed to sharpen, its outline becoming clearer, more deliberate. It was tall, impossibly so, with an odd curvature that didn't match any object I could think of. I flicked on a nearby lamp, flooding the room with warm light. The staircase glowed golden for a heartbeat, the figure dissolving into ordinary darkness. Relief washed over me, thin and fleeting. Then the lamp flickered. In that brief moment of dimming light, I saw it again. Closer this time, as if it had risen 2 steps while I blinked. My breath hitched. I backed toward the parlor, the floor groaning beneath me like a warning. A memory surfaced unbidden, an article I'd read about how low lighting conditions confuse the brain, how ancient survival instincts can misfire, making us see predators in harmless shapes. I wanted to believe that was what was happening, but deep down, I knew better. The shadow began to stretch upward, its head nearly grazing the ceiling, and though it had no eyes, I felt it watching me. Somewhere in the distance, the grandfather clock began to chime, each note echoing like a countdown. And then, in the suffocating stillness, the shadow moved, like a ripple passing through thick smoke. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was deliberate, a slow, almost taunting glide along the edge of the staircase. My lungs seized and I forced myself to breathe quietly, terrified that even the sound of my own fear might draw its attention. The house suddenly felt cavernous, every corner a potential hiding place, every shadow a threat waiting to unfurl. I stumbled backward, reaching blindly for the lamp's pull chain, desperate to drown the room in light. When the bulb flared to life, its glow seemed weaker than before, like a dying star barely holding on. For a single, trembling moment, the staircase was ordinary again. The banister, the worn carpet runner, the elegant wallpaper, nothing out of place. My pulse began to slow, my mind eager to write this off as fatigue or overactive imagination. But then I noticed something chilling. The light wasn't casting my shadow where it should have been. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the floor, and saw nothing. My own form seemed to have vanished from the world, as though I were no longer part of its natural order. The realization sent a rush of cold through my veins, leaving me unsteady on my feet. From somewhere above, a faint creak echoed, a footstep, deliberate and heavy. The children. My instinct screamed for me to run upstairs and check on them, but a darker fear rooted me to the spot. If I left the safety of this room, I'd be walking straight into whatever was waiting on those stairs. My mind whirled with half-formed images, pale hands reaching through the banister, a whisper brushing my ear, the shape swallowing me whole like a mouth closing. I forced myself to think logically. I remembered reading about the Ganzfeld effect, where sensory deprivation tricks the brain into creating hallucinations. Staring too long into stillness, the mind begins to fill in the blanks with its own nightmares. Maybe that's all this is, I told myself. Maybe I'm the unreliable witness here. But even as the thought crossed my mind, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, my breath fogging in the air. A smell of damp earth and something metallic rose from the stairwell, and I realized no psychological phenomenon could explain that. The shadow reappeared, this time not at the base of the stairs but halfway up, its form sharper, almost humanoid. It tilted its head as if studying me, a predator curious about its prey. Then slowly it stepped forward. With each movement, the surrounding shadows seemed to follow, bending unnaturally, like loyal soldiers obeying a silent command. The grandfather clock struck midnight, its tolling deep and resonant. As the final chime faded, the figure emerged fully into the light. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just darkness given shape. It was a person. Their face was hidden beneath a veil of shadow, but when they leaned close enough for me to feel their breath on my cheek, I heard them whisper my name. And then, in a voice trembling with something between wonder and horror, they asked, "Are you sure you're the one who's real?" The first thing they told me, right after handing me a neat list of emergency contacts and bedtime routines, was to stay away from the basement. Their voices had been calm but firm, with that edge of forced casualness that only made me more uneasy. "It's not safe down there," the father said, slipping his coat on as if he couldn't wait to be out the door. "Old steps, bad wiring, you could get hurt." The mother nodded a little too quickly, adding, "Just keep the door closed, always." At first it didn't strike me as strange. Lots of old houses have their quirks, and this one was ancient. The kind of place where the floor groans beneath your feet and the walls seem to exhale cold drafts. But there was something about the way they avoided eye contact when mentioning the basement, like the subject itself was dangerous. Their teenage daughter had lingered by the doorway, silent, her wide eyes fixed on me as though she wanted to say something but didn't dare. For the first hour, everything felt ordinary enough. The kids were in bed, the house quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional tick of the radiator pipes. I curled up on the couch, trying to lose myself in a book. But then I heard it, a soft, deliberate click from the kitchen. When I went to check, my stomach dropped. The basement door was standing wide open. It hadn't been like that when the parents left. I was sure of it. The sight of it felt wrong, like a wound in the house's anatomy. A sour metallic smell wafted up from below, sharp enough to sting the back of my throat. It wasn't just the earthy scent of an old cellar. It carried something fouler, like rust mingled with rot. I shut the door quickly, my pulse racing, and latched the old brass bolt with trembling fingers. Back in the living room, I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the latch was loose. Maybe a draft had pushed it open. I tried to focus on my book again, but my eyes kept drifting toward the darkened kitchen, listening. 20 minutes later, the click came again. I moved slowly this time, my bare feet silent against the worn hardwood floor. The kitchen was empty, but the door, that damn door, was open again, just a crack, as if someone had eased it open carefully, almost politely. A chill slid down my spine. I slammed it shut and dragged a chair in front of it, wedging it beneath the knob like a barricade. That's when I heard it. A sound floated up from the darkness below. So faint at first I thought I'd imagined it, a soft, high-pitched whimper, like a child trying not to cry. It echoed strangely, bouncing off unseen walls, making it impossible to tell how far away it was. My logical mind kicked in, recalling how sound behaves in enclosed spaces, how reverberations can warp and shift depending on angles and surfaces. But as the whimper grew louder, more urgent, I realized with sick certainty that it wasn't staying in one place. It was moving, and it was coming closer. The moment I realized the crying was moving, my body went rigid as if fear had turned my veins to ice. It wasn't just a sound drifting upward from the depths. It had rhythm, momentum, like small, frantic footsteps climbing toward me through the darkness. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself, my breath shallow and quick, every instinct screaming at me to run. But some darker, more dangerous impulse held me there. I needed to know what was beneath this house. I crouched near the floor, pressing my ear against the cold wooden boards. The cries were sharper now, jagged with desperation, interspersed with a low scratching sound, like fingernails raking across stone. My mind raced through possible explanations. A trapped animal, the creak of pipes, even auditory hallucinations brought on by stress. But none of those sounded so heartbreakingly human. It was the kind of sound that bypasses reason entirely, digging straight into the primal part of your brain that knows when something is terribly wrong. Slowly, I removed the chair blocking the door, the legs scraping softly against the tile. My fingers fumbled at the latch, and for a brief second I hesitated. The smell wafting from the crack was thicker now, metallic and wet, clinging to the back of my throat like iron dust. It was the scent of something that didn't belong in a clean, well-kept home. Something alive, or something that used to be. I opened the door just wide enough to peer inside. A single naked bulb hung from the ceiling by a frayed cord, swaying slightly as though recently disturbed. Its weak glow spilled down the narrow staircase, revealing steep wooden steps descending into a black void. The walls seemed to drink the light, and at the very bottom, shadows shifted in ways that defied logic. The cries rose in pitch, echoing wildly off the walls until it felt like they were coming from all directions. My training in sound localization told me to listen for delays and reflections, to pinpoint the source. But there was no center, no origin point. It was as if the basement itself was weeping. My hand trembled as I reached for the switch at the top of the stairs, but before I could touch it, a sudden slam echoed beneath me. The bulb swung violently, throwing jagged shards of light and shadow across the steps. Something was down there, and it was moving fast. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance, but the moment I turned to flee, a blur of motion surged upward. Cold air rushed past my legs, carrying with it a guttural hiss that sounded almost like laughter. I barely caught a glimpse, a hunched silhouette, limbs too long, moving impossibly quick. The force of its movement yanked the door wide open before it slammed shut with a violent crack, the latch snapping into place on its own. The cries ceased instantly, replaced by suffocating silence. Heart hammering, I stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the sealed door. Then from the other side came the slow, deliberate sound of breathing, and it wasn't moving away. It started like any other babysitting gig. A quiet suburban house, a fridge full of snacks, and 2 kids asleep before their parents even pulled out of the driveway. The mother had handed me a handwritten list of numbers, smiling in that slightly frazzled way that parents do when they're trying to pretend they're not rushing. "We'll have our phones if you need us," she'd said. The father added a quick wave, And then the door shut, leaving me in a house that suddenly felt much bigger than it had a moment before. By 10 o'clock, the stillness had become comforting. I sat on the living room couch, scrolling through my phone, the soft glow of the lamp painting golden pools of light on the hardwood floor. Every so often, I'd glance at the baby monitor on the table beside me. The children's breathing came through in a faint, steady rhythm, a metronome of safety. I told myself it was going to be an easy night. Then my phone rang. The sharp sound shattered the calm like a dropped plate. My first thought was of the parents, maybe checking in. But when I saw the caller ID, my stomach gave a strange, heavy lurch. It wasn't my phone at all. It was their landline. Their house phone ringing from somewhere upstairs. I hesitated before answering. Maybe they'd forgotten something, I reasoned, even though the thought didn't sit right. When I finally swiped to pick up, there was no hello, no greeting, just a single, whispered sentence. "Check on the kids." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat frozen, my mind racing. The parents were supposed to be at a restaurant across town. Why would they call from their own house? A prank, I told myself. Maybe one of the kids had snuck out of bed and dialed the number for fun. But even as I tried to rationalize, my skin prickled with a crawling unease. The monitor remained steady, the soft sound of breathing unchanged. That should have calmed me, but instead it made my chest tighten. Something about the words, the way they'd been spoken, barely more than a breath, carried a weight that felt older than any joke a child could pull. Grabbing my phone, I forced myself to move toward the staircase. The house seemed to stretch taller around me, the upper hallway a yawning black tunnel. Each step groaned under my weight like it was warning me to turn back. Halfway up, I froze. From somewhere above, I heard it, the faint trill of a phone ringing again. I hurried the rest of the way, my pulse loud in my ears. The sound led me to the children's room, where the air felt unnaturally cold. The kids slept peacefully in their beds, their faces soft and serene. But the ringing didn't stop. It was close now, impossibly close. I followed it to a small wooden toy chest pushed against the far wall. The lid was slightly ajar. As I reached for it, my hand shaking, the ringing stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate knock from inside the chest. And then, in the silence that followed, a voice whispered my name. For a moment, I couldn't move. My hand hovered above the toy chest, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like they were filled with wet cement. The voice that had whispered my name hadn't been playful or curious. It had been deliberate, intimate, like someone leaning close enough for their lips to almost brush my ear. It felt wrong, profoundly wrong, in a way I couldn't put into words. The children shifted slightly in their sleep, a small, innocent reminder that they were still there, still safe. But that fragile sense of safety was unraveling by the second. The toy chest sat in the corner like a trap door into another world, its lid cracked just enough for darkness to seep out. I swallowed hard and told myself it had to be a toy, some battery-operated gadget the parents forgot to mention. Logic, thin and desperate, was the only shield I had against the storm building in my mind. I knelt down and lifted the lid. The inside of the chest was a chaotic jumble of dolls, action figures, and stuffed animals, their plastic eyes catching the faint glow of the nightlight. For one dizzying second, I thought I saw something shift beneath them. A subtle movement, like a ripple beneath the surface of water. But when I blinked, it was gone. No phone. No explanation. The air smelled strange inside the chest, metallic and stale, as though it had been sealed for far longer than a toy box ever should be. I started to push the toys aside, digging deeper, when I heard a sound behind me. The phone was ringing again. I spun around, my breath catching. This time the sound wasn't coming from the chest at all. It was coming from the closet. A narrow door on the far side of the room stood half open, a sliver of darkness spilling out like smoke. The ringing was muffled, rhythmic, and horribly patient, each tone stretching longer than the last, as though time itself had begun to warp around it. I crossed the room on trembling legs, pausing to glance back at the children. They hadn't stirred once, even with the noise. Their stillness seemed unnatural now, like mannequins arranged in perfect imitation of sleep. My hand closed around the cold brass knob. For a heartbeat, I stood there, listening to the sound reverberate through the wood. I thought of how modern technology is supposed to connect us, to make us feel safe. Yet in that moment, the phone was a thread pulling me closer to something monstrous. I yanked the door open. The closet was small and empty, or at least it seemed that way at first. Then I noticed the shadows weren't falling quite right. In the back corner, crouched low like a coiled spring, was a figure. Its head was bowed, its limbs folded in a way no human body should bend. Clutched in its pale, skeletal hands was a cordless phone. The ringing stopped. Slowly, the figure lifted its head, and in the darkness, I heard it speak in a perfect imitation of the mother's voice. "Check on the kids." The house was silent in a way that felt almost unnatural, like stepping into a painting rather than a home. Most places breathe. The hum of a refrigerator, the whisper of pipes, the distant murmur of a TV down the hall. But this mansion had none of that. It was a vacuum of sound, and the moment the door closed behind me, it swallowed even the faintest trace of the outside world. My footsteps on the marble floor rang out like cannon fire, then were devoured by the stillness so completely that I found myself holding my breath. Afraid of disturbing something ancient and sleeping, the parents had left in a rush, offering quick instructions before disappearing into the night. Their voices had seemed almost too loud for this place, echoing off the high ceilings with a kind of embarrassed urgency. "He's already asleep," the mother had whispered, as though the house itself might overhear. "Just check on him once or twice, and don't be startled if it feels a little too quiet." You get used to it, but I wasn't getting used to it. If anything, the longer I sat alone in the vast living room, the heavier the silence became. It wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, pressing in on me like water filling a sinking ship. I thought about how the human brain is wired for sound, how even subtle noises, the buzz of electricity, the whoosh of distant traffic, provide anchors that tell us we're not alone. Without them, the mind starts to turn inward, amplifying its own fears until they echo louder than any real threat. I tried to distract myself with my phone, but even the faint tapping of my thumbs against the screen felt offensive in this cathedral-like space. My own breathing sounded ragged and uneven, like I'd run a mile instead of simply sitting on a couch. At one point, I reached for the glass of water on the coffee table and nearly dropped it when the faint clink of ice startled me. That was when I realized how bad it had gotten, how deeply this place was unspooling my nerves. Time blurred. Minutes felt like hours. I found myself straining to hear something, anything. Even the creak of settling wood would have been a comfort. But there was nothing. Just the crushing, absolute quiet. It was like being suspended in a sensory deprivation tank. Except instead of floating, I felt pinned down, as though the silence had weight. When the sound finally came, it was almost a relief. A single sharp thud from somewhere above me, breaking the stillness like a stone-shattering glass. I exhaled shakily, my first instinct to laugh. Finally, I thought. Something normal. Houses make noises. This is fine. But the relief curdled the moment I realized where it had come from. The noise wasn't random. It had a direction, a location. It had come from the far end of the upstairs hallway. The nursery, where the baby was supposed to be sleeping, sank in. A thud wasn't a natural baby sound. Babies whimper, coo, cry. They don't create sharp, deliberate noises like that. I stared up at the ornate staircase spiraling into the darkness above, every instinct telling me to stay put. But another, more primal urge, the protective instinct that takes over when a child might be in danger, forced me to move. Each step upward felt monumental, my footfalls unnervingly loud against the plush runner. It struck me how strange it was to hear them at all. The house seemed to absorb most sounds, but my own movements sliced through the silence like a blade through fabric. My breathing echoed in my ears, ragged and quick, while all around me, the world stayed eerily still. I couldn't even hear the wind outside, as though the house existed in its own sealed bubble. Cut off from the rest of reality. Halfway up, I paused, straining to listen. Nothing. The kind of nothing that made my eardrums ache. I thought about studies I'd read about sensory deprivation, how silence at this level isn't peaceful but punishing. The nervous system starts to rebel, creating phantom noises to fill the void. People begin to hear their own pulse, their own blood moving. Some even hear voices that aren't there. I wondered if that's what was happening to me, but then came another sound, faint but distinct, a soft shuffle, like cloth dragging across wood. It was coming from the nursery. A wave of cold swept over me. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe the baby had managed to climb out of his crib, though the parents had insisted he was too young for that. Maybe a curtain had shifted, a toy had fallen. Logic fought to maintain control, but beneath it lurked the undeniable truth that I wasn't alone up here. When I reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out like a tunnel, lined with closed doors. At the far end, the nursery door stood ajar, a thin wedge of light spilling onto the polished floor. My shadow stretched long and distorted ahead of me, quivering as I crept forward. Each step felt like walking deeper into a dream I couldn't wake from. I reached out, fingertips brushing the doorframe, and pushed it open. The nursery was immaculate. White walls, soft blankets, a mobile gently swaying above the crib. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. The baby lay motionless, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady. Relief nearly buckled my knees. I stepped closer, my voice breaking as I whispered his name. That's when I saw it. The mobile above the crib wasn't moving because of air currents. It was spinning backward, its cheerful figures rotating in slow, unnatural circles, as though unseen hands were winding it up. A floorboard behind me groaned. I turned, but there was nothing there. Only the gaping darkness of the hallway, and then, from somewhere within that darkness, came a third sound, a wet, deliberate breath drawn in slowly, like whoever it belonged to was savoring the silence as much as I dreaded it. The first time Lily waved at the window, I didn't think anything of it. She was 5, the perfect age for imaginary friends and bedtime rituals that made no sense to anyone but her. I watched her tiny hand flutter back and forth as she giggled, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the bedside lamp. When I asked who she was waving at, she simply said, "My friend," with the solemn certainty that only a child can have. I smiled, tucking her in and brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Kids create whole worlds in their heads, and I figured this was no different. Still, as I closed her door that first night, a strange unease rippled through me. The window above her bed opened onto the backyard, a wide, dark expanse framed by an ancient oak tree whose limbs clawed at the sky like skeletal hands. Beyond that was nothing but woods. The kind of darkness that swallows you whole. Night after night, the ritual repeated. Lily would stand at the window, whispering and waving while I lingered in the doorway, pretending not to be unnerved. I reminded myself of a psychological phenomenon I'd once read about. Pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find faces and figures in random patterns. Maybe she was just seeing shapes in the branches, her mind filling in the blanks. Humans are wired to look for meaning, even where none exists. But then came the 7th night. The house was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Lily was already at the window when I entered, her small silhouette outlined against the glass. "He's here," she whispered without turning around. There was an odd reverence in her voice, as though she were speaking of a beloved guest finally arriving. I opened my mouth to reassure her, but then I saw it, a shape just beyond the glass. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection of my own movement, but no, it was outside, standing in the shadow of the oak tree. The figure was pale, almost luminescent against the darkness, its arm rising in a slow, deliberate wave. My stomach dropped. The motion was too precise, too human to be a coincidence. "Who is that?" My voice cracked, betraying my fear. Lily didn't answer. She simply pressed her palm to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she smiled. The figure mirrored her exactly, palm to palm, separated only by a thin pane of glass and a few feet of cold night air. Every instinct screamed at me to grab her and run, but I couldn't seem to move. My mind flailed for rational explanations. A neighbor playing a prank, a lost hiker, anything but what my gut was telling me. That something unnatural was lurking in the darkness, watching us. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure stepped back and vanished into the trees. I exhaled shakily, finally pulling Lily away from the window. But even as I hugged her, my skin crawled with the certainty that it hadn't left. It was simply waiting for me to turn my back. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house felt amplified, every shadow a threat lurking just beyond my reach. Lily, on the other hand, drifted off peacefully, clutching her stuffed rabbit as if nothing had happened. Her steady breathing was the only sound in the room, a fragile rhythm I clung to while I sat in the rocking chair near her bed. I kept my eyes on the window, convinced that if I looked away, I'd see that pale figure again. Closer this time, maybe even pressing its face against the glass. The hours dragged like a slow, aching tide. My mind wandered to what I'd seen, replaying every detail, every twitch of its hand. Humans are pattern seekers by nature. In darkness, our brains scramble to impose order, to see familiar shapes where there are none. It's why we find faces in clouds or hear voices in static. Maybe what I'd seen was nothing more than my own terrified mind creating a monster from the chaos of the night. I repeated this logic like a mantra, but deep down, I didn't believe it. That wave had been too deliberate. At some point, exhaustion won out. My eyes fluttered shut for what felt like seconds. When I jerked awake, the room was thick with a suffocating stillness. Something felt wrong. Lily's breathing, so steady before, was gone. I shot to my feet, my heart pounding. The bed was empty. Panic surged through me in a blinding rush. I scanned the room, hoping she'd simply rolled onto the floor or wandered to her toy chest. Nothing. Her blanket lay crumpled at the foot of the bed, still warm. My gaze snapped to the window, and that's when my blood ran cold. The window was wide open. The curtains fluttered inward like pale ghosts caught in a silent scream. A gust of night air rushed in, carrying with it the earthy, damp smell of the woods. On the windowsill was a single muddy footprint, small and perfect, like a grotesque signature. I stumbled forward, leaning out into the darkness. The backyard stretched endlessly, the oak tree looming like a sentinel at the edge of the lawn. Beyond it, the forest was a solid wall of black, impenetrable and endless. My voice tore from my throat, screaming Lily's name into the void. The only answer was the whisper of wind through the branches, a sound that somehow felt like laughter. Then movement, a flicker of white deep among the trees. For a heartbeat, I saw her, or thought I did, standing beside that same pale figure, her small hand clasped in its skeletal one. She didn't struggle. She didn't even look afraid. She just turned her head and waved. I blinked, and they were gone. I collapsed to my knees beneath the window, sobbing, the cold air burning my lungs. Behind me, the rocking chair began to move on its own, slow and rhythmic, as if someone invisible had settled into it. And from the darkness outside, a low, mocking voice whispered, "Wave back." The storm arrived without warning, sweeping through the neighborhood like an angry tide. One moment, the house was full of soft, domestic sounds, the hum of the fridge, the ticking of the hallway clock, and the next, everything went dark. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the baby monitor went dead, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt ancient, stripped of all modern comforts. I fumbled through drawers in the kitchen, desperate for a flashlight. My phone's screen barely pierced the darkness, throwing nervous, trembling light across the walls. The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows like 1,000 tiny fists. I could hear the trees groaning in the wind, their branches scraping against the siding like fingernails on a coffin lid. Somewhere deep inside me, an unease I couldn't name began to rise. The third drawer I opened stuck halfway, as if something inside resisted being found. With a sharp tug, it slid open, and that's when I saw it. Lying on top of a jumble of mismatched batteries and paper clips was a single, square Polaroid. In the chaos of a blackout, an old picture is meaningless. But the image drew me in like gravity. It showed a girl I didn't recognize, standing in the very same kitchen where I now stood. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her mouth caught mid-scream. There was something raw and desperate about her expression, a terror so vivid it felt contagious. I turned the photo over, half expecting a date or name scrawled on the back. Nothing, just blank white space. My hands trembled as I flipped it back again. That's when I noticed the background. At first glance, it was just darkness, the inevitable grainy blur of a poorly lit room. But as I held it closer to the glow of my phone, shapes began to emerge. Figures, faint and skeletal, clustered in the corners. They weren't standing naturally. Their limbs seemed bent at odd angles, their heads tilted as though listening. My breath caught. These weren't random patterns. They were exactly like the shadows I'd been glimpsing all evening, just at the edge of my vision. Every time I turned quickly, they vanished, leaving me doubting my sanity. But here they were, frozen forever in glossy permanence. A thought wormed its way into my mind. Polaroids capture a single, unchangeable moment. Unlike digital photos, they can't be edited or erased. They hold the truth, whether you want to see it or not. The wind howled, and the lights flickered briefly, teasing me with hope before plunging the house back into darkness. Somewhere upstairs, a door creaked open, followed by the unmistakable patter of tiny footsteps. The children were supposed to be asleep. Clutching the photo, I forced myself to move toward the staircase. The storm outside seemed to pulse with my heartbeat, a living thing pressing against the walls. At the top of the stairs, a shadow darted across the landing. Quick, deliberate. I stared down at the Polaroid one last time. The girl's terrified eyes seemed to plead with me. And in that instant, I realized the background figures weren't just similar to the shadows in this house. They were identical down to the last crooked limb, and they weren't staying frozen in the photo anymore. I stumbled back, clutching the photo so tightly the edges dug into my skin. The air felt suddenly heavier, as though the house had drawn a deep breath and was holding it, waiting for me to make a move. My rational mind fought for control, trying to explain it all away. Old pictures, tricks of the light, the natural fear that comes with darkness. But deep inside, a quieter, older instinct whispered that none of this was coincidence. The storm outside roared louder, rattling the windows and casting warped shadows across the walls. For a brief moment, the lightning illuminated the hallway, and in that flash, I saw them, the figures from the Polaroid. They weren't blurry now. They were clear, tangible, their twisted bodies unfolding from the darkness like paper crumpling in reverse. By the time the light faded, they were gone, leaving only the memory of their impossible shapes burned into my vision. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled toward the children's room. Their safety was the only thing tethering me to action. I burst through the door, only to find them asleep, completely undisturbed, their small chests rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost mechanical. The room smelled faintly of damp earth, a strange contrast to the innocence of the scene. I backed out slowly, careful not to wake them, and turned my attention to the upstairs hallway. My phone's light swung wildly, carving tunnels through the pitch-black corridors. At the far end stood a narrow cabinet, its single drawer cracked open, inviting. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I realized with sick certainty that I hadn't opened it earlier. Drawn forward like a moth to a flame, I approached the cabinet. The closer I came, the colder the air grew until every breath felt like inhaling ice. When I finally reached it, I hesitated, knowing whatever waited inside would change everything. My hand shook as I gripped the handle and pulled. Inside was another Polaroid, fresh. The chemical scent of developing film still clung to it, sharp and unmistakable. My stomach twisted as I turned it toward the light. It was me. I stood in the photograph exactly as I was now, holding the original Polaroid of the terrified girl. My mouth was open in a silent scream, my eyes wide and pleading, the same expression she had worn. And behind me, crowding the edges of the frame, were the figures. Dozens of them. I spun around in panic, but the hallway was empty. Only darkness stared back at me. My grip loosened, and both photos slipped from my fingers, fluttering to the floor like dead leaves. Then came the sound of the camera. A sharp mechanical click from somewhere just behind me. Slowly, dread clawing up my spine, I turned my head. In the sliver of light cast by my phone, a shape emerged from the shadows. Tall, skeletal, its fingers curled around an ancient Polaroid camera. The lens pointed directly at me. Before I could scream, the blinding white flash went off, freezing me in a moment I would never escape. Children have a way of saying things that seem harmless at first, until the words sink in and take root like a seed of dread. That night began with giggles and whispers, the kind that float easily through bedtime routines. The two kids I was watching, Noah and Emily, were tucked beneath their quilts, their wide eyes shimmering in the glow of the nightlight. Emily looked at me with the kind of serious expression only a 5-year-old can muster and said, "Don't let the laughing man out." I laughed, assuming it was some bedtime game or an imaginary friend they'd invented together. "The laughing man?" I repeated, smiling. Noah, who was older and usually more skeptical, nodded solemnly. "He lives inside the walls," he said. "He only comes out when it's really, really quiet." The way he spoke was so matter-of-fact it made me pause. But I brushed it off, assuring them there was nothing in the walls except old wood and pipes. When I closed their door, though, the words clung to me. The laughing man. It was a strange phrase, sticky in my mind. Houses make noises all the time. The groan of settling wood, the whisper of wind through cracks. Our brains are wired to find patterns in these random sounds, sometimes even assigning voices to them. I reminded myself of that as I sat alone in the living room, the house quieting around me like a held breath. But then I heard it. At first, it was so faint I thought it was my imagination, a muffled chuckle buried deep within the walls. It was a strange low sound, like someone laughing into a pillow. I froze, straining to listen. The laughter came again, clearer this time, higher pitched, gleeful, and far too close. My pulse spiked and a cold sweat prickled my skin. Logic scrambled to take over. I'd read about infrasound, low-frequency vibrations that can cause unease and even hallucinations. Maybe the storm outside had shifted something in the structure of the house. My ears could be playing tricks on me, conjuring up phantom sounds to match the kids' eerie bedtime story. I rose slowly, following the sound through the hallway. My steps felt unbearably loud against the old hardwood floor. The laughter seemed to move as I did, always staying just ahead of me, as though leading me somewhere. It wasn't constant. It came in bursts, like someone gasping for breath between fits of mirth. There was something almost playful about it, which somehow made it worse. By the time I reached the far end of the hallway, my heart was pounding so hard it drowned out my thoughts. A narrow strip of baseboard seemed out of place here, slightly misaligned with the rest of the wall. As I knelt to examine it, the laughter stopped abruptly, leaving a vacuum of silence so complete it hurt my ears. And then, with a slow, deliberate creak, a hidden crawl-space door swung open on its own. From the darkness inside, something began to what I was seeing. The darkness inside the crawl space seemed alive, folding and unfolding like thick smoke. Then a hand emerged, or something like one. It was too long, too thin, the skin stretched taut over bone. The nails scraped against the wooden floor with a sound that made my teeth ache. The thing that followed was grinning. It didn't crawl like a person. It slithered, its limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy, each joint moving with a sickening fluidity. Its wide mouth stretched unnaturally from ear to ear, packed with jagged teeth that gleamed faintly in the dim light. That grin never faltered, even as its chest rose and fell in a jerky rhythm, accompanied by that same horrible laughter I'd heard through the walls. Only now it was deafening, raw and unrestrained. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on the uneven floorboards. My body screamed at me to run, but some part of my mind, frozen in terror, fixated on how human the laughter had sounded when I first heard it. Up close, though, it was wrong. Too many pitches layered together, like several voices laughing at once. It reminded me of recordings I'd heard of distorted radio signals, a sound our brains tried desperately to fit into something recognizable. The creature crawled fully into the hallway now, its grin widening as if it could smell my fear. My thoughts spiraled. Maybe this was some kind of mass hallucination triggered by the house itself. I remembered reading about shared delusions, how suggestion can infect perception. The kids had spoken of the laughing man, and now I was seeing him, my senses warped by their belief. But then Emily screamed. Her tiny voice cut through the chaos like a knife. I whipped around to see both children standing at the end of the hallway, their faces pale, their small hands clutching each other. They weren't imagining this. They saw it too. The thing's laughter rose to a fever pitch, echoing off the walls until the entire house seemed to shake. It lunged toward the children with a speed that defied logic, its limbs a blur. Pure instinct took over. I charged forward, scooping them into my arms and sprinting toward the staircase. The creature's nails raked the wall behind us, leaving deep splintered gouges that rained wood chips onto the floor. We tumbled down the stairs, my body taking the brunt of the fall. Pain flared hot across my ribs, but there was no time to stop. I shoved the front door open and spilled into the night air, the storm pelting us with cold rain. Behind me, the house pulsed with laughter, a cacophony that seemed to seep from every wall, every crevice. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. In the silence that followed, I dared to glance back. The doorway was empty. The hall beyond was dark and still, like nothing had ever been there. But as the wind died, a new sound drifted to me, faint, muffled, unmistakable. Laughter, from inside the walls. The first time I heard it, I thought it was the wind. A soft, breathy whisper threading through the quiet house as I tidied up the toys scattered across the living room rug. My name, spoken so faintly it could have been a trick of the mind. I froze mid-step, listening. Nothing. Only the gentle hum of the heater and the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock. With a nervous laugh, I shook my head. Too many late-night horror movies, I told myself. The doll sat propped on the couch where Lily had left it, a delicate porcelain thing with painted rosebud lips and glassy blue eyes that never seemed to focus quite right. She called it Margaret, and while most dolls unnerved me, this one felt heavier somehow, as though its blank stare wasn't blank at all, but deliberate. I turned it to face the cushions and moved on, eager to dismiss the shiver crawling up my spine. Lily had been especially attached to it lately. She wouldn't sleep unless Margaret was nearby, nestled against her pillow like a silent guardian. That night, after I tucked her in and read a story, she clutched the doll tightly and whispered, "Don't let her get lonely." The request struck me as oddly specific. I promised I wouldn't, even though the thought of keeping that doll company made my stomach twist. As the evening stretched on, the whisper came again. This time clearer, slicing through the stillness with unmistakable intent. My name elongated into a chilling sigh. I dropped the dish I was washing, the crash echoing through the house like a gunshot. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Pareidolia, I reminded myself. The brain's tendency to impose patterns on random sounds. A faulty vent, the creak of settling pipes. My mind was searching for meaning where there was none. But when I crept back into the living room, the doll wasn't where I'd left it. Margaret now sat upright on the coffee table, her head tilted just enough to suggest she'd been watching the hallway. My skin prickled as I scanned the room. Certain Lily must have woken up and moved it. Yet the monitor showed her still asleep, her tiny body curled beneath the quilt, breathing slow and steady. My pulse thudded painfully as I reached for the doll. Its porcelain surface was cold, almost damp, like something left out in the rain. I set it firmly back on the couch and whispered to no one, "Stay." By the third time, there was no mistaking it. I had gone to check on Lily, only to return and find the doll perched on the windowsill, staring out into the night. The whispering was louder now, frantic, urgent. My name repeated again and again like a warning. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The whispers weren't coming from the doll itself. They were coming from the walls, reverberating through the house like a chorus of unseen mouths. When I turned back, Margaret was gone. Behind me, the living room floor creaked. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance, my heart thundering in my chest. The room was empty, or at least it appeared to be. The shadows in the corners felt too thick, clinging to the walls like spilled ink. The air had grown colder, heavy with a damp metallic tang that reminded me of old pennies. My breath plumed visibly as I backed toward the center of the room, whispering Lily's name as if saying it out loud could tether me to something safe. A faint scuttling sound broke the silence. It was quick, erratic, like tiny feet scurrying just beneath the floorboards. My mind flashed back to Lily's strange request earlier. Don't let her get lonely. It didn't sound like a child's casual comment anymore. It sounded like a warning. Then I saw her. The doll was sitting upright on the far side of the room, half hidden beneath the edge of an armchair. Her painted blue eyes gleamed in the dim light, and though porcelain should be lifeless, I swore I saw the faintest flutter of movement behind them, like something watching me from inside. I bent down slowly, my trembling fingers hovering just above its smooth, cold head. "What are you?" I breathed, more to myself than to it. That's when the house seemed to exhale. The whisper surged all at once, no longer faint but deafening, an overlapping chorus of my name rising from the walls. It felt as though the house itself was alive, hundreds of invisible mouths chanting in unison. My ears rang, my vision blurring as I stumbled back, clutching my head. Margaret toppled from the chair with a clatter, and then she moved. Not far, not fast, but undeniably deliberate. She righted herself with a jerky twist of her limbs, like a marionette yanked by unseen strings. My rational mind fractured under the weight of it. I had been so sure the doll was the threat, but now a darker, more horrifying realization bloomed. She wasn't haunting this place. She was fighting it. A sound like nails on a chalkboard echoed from Lily's bedroom. I sprinted down the hall, my feet barely touching the ground. The door was open, swaying gently. Inside, Lily sat upright in bed, eyes wide with terror. A black shifting mass clung to the corner of the ceiling, its shape amorphous, its many voices blending into one guttural whisper. My name. Before I could scream, Margaret darted across the floor, impossibly fast. She positioned herself between Lily and the shadow, her glassy eyes now glowing faintly from within. The whispering faltered, replaced by a low guttural hiss. With a violent shudder, the shadow recoiled, vanishing into the walls as if sucked through cracks too small for anything real to pass through. The room went silent, save for Lily's shaky sobs. I scooped her into my arms, my own tears mixing with hers. When I turned back, Margaret lay motionless on the floor, her painted face once again blank and serene. Then, from the front door, came a slow, deliberate knock. Margaret's head snapped toward the sound, a haze of unease and unanswered questions. By the time the clock struck midnight, my only thought was escape. I gathered my things with trembling hands, desperate to leave the house and the gnawing dread that clung to its walls like mold. The air inside felt heavy, damp with an almost metallic tang that seemed to sink into my skin. Even the silence felt unnatural, thick and watchful, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I approached the front door with the shaky relief of someone reaching the finish line of a nightmare. The brass handle was cool beneath my fingers. I turned it eagerly, and nothing happened. The door didn't budge. Confused, I tried again, twisting harder, then shoving my shoulder against the wood. It groaned but held firm, locked by something far stronger than a simple latch. My pulse quickened, a wild animal trapped in a cage. Panic surged. I spun around, scanning the hallway for another exit. The windows, of course. I darted to the nearest one and yanked the curtain aside. That's when I saw them. Outside, in the yard, stood a figure. No, several figures. Dark silhouettes arranged in a perfect, unnatural stillness. They didn't move, didn't sway with the wind. They were just there, watching. Their shapes were human, but wrong somehow, like mannequins carved by someone who had only heard rumors of what people looked like. A sharp breath escaped me, fogging the glass. My mind reeled, scrambling for rational explanations. Maybe neighbors caught in the storm. Maybe tree shadows distorted by the porch light. Humans are wired to detect faces and forms even where none exist. It's why we see shapes in clouds, monsters in darkness. I clung to that thought like a lifeline. But then one of the figures tilted its head. The motion was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it shattered any illusion of safety. As if in silent command, the others followed, their heads turning in unison toward me. My stomach dropped. This wasn't random. They weren't illusions. I staggered back, my breath ragged. Heart hammering, I raced to another window. More figures, this time closer, their outlines pressing against the edges of the glass. No features, only the sense of eyes where none should be. Their stillness felt worse than motion, like predators coiled and ready to strike. Frantically, I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the screen remained black, unresponsive, dead. The storm outside had killed the signal, leaving me severed from the world. The house groaned around me, an ancient sound like wood remembering every terrible thing it had ever witnessed. I tried every door, every lock, but the result was always the same, sealed shut, as though the house itself conspired to keep me inside. At the living room window, I risked one final glance outside. The figures were closer now, a perfect ring encircling the house, and this time, every single one of them was raising a hand to wave. The wave was slow, deliberate, a sick parody of a friendly greeting. My body locked up, every nerve screaming in primal recognition of a predator's signal. The motion was too precise, too synchronized. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the rug, my hands scraping against the cold wooden floor. For a moment, I just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, willing this nightmare to dissolve into reason. But when I rose to my knees and peeked over the windowsill, they were closer again. Their hands now pressed flat against the glass, smudging the panes with streaks of condensation. Though they had no visible faces, I felt their gaze like a physical weight pressing against my skin. I ran for the back door, my breath ragged, lungs burning as if the very air were poisoned. The knob wouldn't turn. I kicked it, slammed my shoulder into it until my bones ached, but the door held fast. Behind me, the walls seemed to vibrate with a low, resonant hum, like a heartbeat pulsing through the structure of the house. My mind spiraled back to every story I'd endured over these long nights. The whispering doll, the crawlspace laughter, the figure at the window. Each horror had felt separate, isolated. But now, staring at those faceless watchers surrounding the house, I wondered if they'd been threads of the same web all along. Each event a trap tightening around me. Lightning flashed, flooding the room with harsh white light. For a split second, the glass became a mirror, and in that reflection, I saw something that turned my blood to ice. The figures weren't outside anymore. They were behind me. I spun around at nothing. Just darkness, heavy and suffocating. The reflection had lied, or maybe it hadn't. Maybe it had shown what was coming. Shaking, I grabbed a fireplace poker, gripping it so tightly the iron bit into my palm. My only plan was survival. I smashed one of the smaller windows with all my strength. Glass exploded outward into the night air. Cold wind rushed in, slicing across my face like a blade. For half a heartbeat, I felt hope. Then a hand reached through the broken window. It wasn't a hand like mine. The fingers were long, jointed wrong, the skin stretched pale and thin. They gripped the sill with impossible strength, pulling forward. Behind it came another hand and another. I staggered back as more figures pressed toward the broken glass, their movements jerky, insect-like. The hum inside the walls grew louder, drowning out my own heartbeat. I realized, too late, that breaking the window hadn't freed me. It had invited them in. The lights flickered violently. In that strobe-like chaos, the room filled with their shapes. They were everywhere, surrounding me, their raised hands now reaching, grasping. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed everything was the sharp, crystalline sound of every window shattering at once, followed by silence, and then a single drawn-out whisper of my name. Subscribe, if you dare.